What would you do if the system forged your mother's signature, stole your paid-off home, and laughed when you stood alone in court to fight back? This is the story of a teacher who turned his kitchen table into a legal war room and took down a corrupt bank with nothing but truth, grit, and a binder full of evidence. Don't blink, because what happens next will shock you. Dear viewer, what you are about to witness is not just a story. It is a powerful testament to the quiet power and pursuit of justice in places most people ignore. If this is your first time here, I warmly invite you to share where you are watching in the comments below. And if stories like this move you, challenge you, or make you think, consider subscribing and clicking the bell icon. We share voices that deserve to be heard every day. Thank you for being here. Now, let's get into the story. The courtroom had never been so still. The judge, a grizzled man with decades on the bench, leaned back in his high-backed leather chair, his lips twitching into an incredulous smirk. "Representing yourself, Mr. Thompson?" he asked, the corners of his mouth curling upward as he adjusted his glasses and glanced toward the bank's legal team, who stifled quiet chuckles. This should be interesting. The man standing at the defendant's table was tall, broad-shouldered, and wore a second-hand gray suit that strained slightly at the seams. His tie was modest, his shoes scuffed, and his presence, though quiet, commanded the attention of everyone in the room. Darius Thompson didn't blink at the judge's condescension. He didn't smile or nod. He simply looked up, calm and firm, and said, "I'm not here to entertain, Your Honor. I'm here to expose the truth. But to understand how we arrived at this moment, we need to step back." 6 months earlier, Darius stood on the creaking porch of the house he had called home for most of his life. The early spring sun cast shadows through the tall oaks that lined his street in East Atlanta. The neighborhood was changing fast. Old homes like his were being snatched up, flipped, and resold to newcomers who didn't know the stories buried in their soil. The manila envelope in his hands trembled slightly. It was stamped with a cold, indifferent message in thick red ink. Final notice. Property to be vacated in 14 days. He blinked, then blinked again. The notice said his home was being repossessed due to failure to pay on a second mortgage. But Darius knew something was wrong. He had paid off the mortgage years ago, paid it off in full. He remembered the day with perfect clarity. The way his mother cried, the neighbors clapped, and he poured glasses of sparkling cider in the kitchen that hadn't been renovated in decades, but still smelled like home. He had framed the final payment receipt. He had lived in this house for 41 years, and it was more than wood and brick. It was memory. It was struggle. It was love. His mother had worked as a nurse in the trauma unit at Grady Hospital, often clocking in double shifts. She had raised Darius and his younger sister alone, putting everything she had into this home. She passed away just last year, but she died believing her legacy was secure. And now this? A foreclosure? Darius stepped inside, heart pounding, and dropped the envelope on the kitchen table. He rifled through the old filing cabinet in the hallway closet. Mortgage statements, tax receipts, deed of title. Every document was there. Every payment accounted for. Then, tucked inside an envelope he didn't recognize, he found it. Second mortgage agreement. The words blurred for a moment. He hadn't seen this before. It was dated 2 years prior, supposedly signed by his mother. But the signature? No, it wasn't right. The D curled the wrong way. The stroke of the T was hesitant, uneven, the slant off. It looked like someone trying to mimic her handwriting, but lacking her certainty. His stomach turned. He called the bank that issued the notice. He was bounced between departments, waiting on hold for over an hour, until finally someone answered. They spoke in clipped tones, their voice void of empathy. "Sir, the home is in foreclosure due to non-payment on the second mortgage. The debt is valid. If you have an issue, you'll need to hire legal counsel." "My mother never took out a second mortgage," Darius insisted. "I have all the original paperwork. She never missed a single payment. She died believing the house was hers." A pause, then a cold sigh. "Well, Mr. Thompson, maybe you weren't fully aware of your mother's financial situation. These things happen. Sometimes people don't tell their families everything." He hung up, not because the conversation was over, but because he knew they would never hear him. The next morning, Darius drove to the local branch. The manager, a young white man named Garrett Sloan, barely looked up from his phone when Darius walked in. "Mr. Thompson, your account is in default. It doesn't matter what paperwork you have." "The signature on that mortgage isn't my mother's," Darius said, keeping his voice even. "I'm asking you to verify the original documents." Sloan's smile was thin. "You people always think the system is out to get you." Those 4 words. You. People. They hung in the air. Darius felt the fire rise in his chest, but swallowed it down. "This is my family's house. You're not taking it without a fight." "Then hire a lawyer." But Darius couldn't afford one. After losing his full-time teaching job due to school district budget cuts, he had been working part-time at a tutoring center, supplementing his income with gigs as a delivery driver. Every dime went into keeping the lights on, buying groceries, and covering property taxes. Legal fees were out of reach. That night, he sat at the same kitchen table where his mother used to sort through bills. The foreclosure notice stared back at him like a slap across the face. He didn't cry. Instead, he pulled out his laptop, opened a new document, and typed 2 words: "Fight back." He dove headfirst into mortgage law. He read through case law, watched lectures on real estate fraud, and taught himself how to file a motion in civil court. For every legal term he didn't understand, he wrote it on a sticky note and plastered it on the walls of his dining room. He barely slept. The weight of injustice bore down on him, but Darius refused to collapse beneath it. He printed out every questionable document, highlighted every inconsistency, built a binder thicker than a phone book. When he wasn't researching, he was knocking on neighbors' doors, sharing his story. More than one person mentioned they'd lost their homes under confusing circumstances. An elderly man, 4 houses down, said the same bank had taken his house the year before. The same manager, the same forged-looking signature. The pattern was forming, and it was ugly. By the time his court date arrived, Darius had become something he never thought he'd need to be: his own lawyer, his own advocate, a one-man army standing in front of an institution that expected him to fall in line and vanish quietly. And so, he stood in the courtroom, alone. The judge laughed, but he wouldn't be laughing for long, because Darius Thompson was not the man they expected, and what he was about to do would shake the walls of that courtroom and beyond. Rain tapped gently against the windows as Darius Thompson sat hunched over his dining room table. A dozen documents spread before him like a battlefield. The old house, once a sanctuary, now felt more like a war room. He hadn't gone back to work in 3 days, using his accumulated sick leave to stay home and dig deeper into the mess that had suddenly engulfed his life. The deeper he looked, the darker things became. The paper trail was twisted, filled with inconsistencies that refused to add up. Dates didn't align. Signatures looked eerily similar across documents dated years apart. Too similar. The supposed second mortgage agreement had been filed 6 months before his mother passed, but there were no financial records to suggest any new funds had been deposited or withdrawn. No correspondence from the bank at the time. No monthly statements. It was as if the loan had appeared from thin air. He took the paperwork to a local attorney named Robert Givens, an old friend of his father's, who now ran a small legal practice in South Atlanta. Robert, a wiry man with a sharp mind, dulled only slightly by time, spent the better part of an hour flipping through the documents in silence. When he finally looked up, his face was grim. "Darius," he said, placing the papers gently on the desk between them. "This doesn't look right. In fact, it smells like classic mortgage fraud." Darius leaned forward. "You see it too?" "I do. But here's the problem. You're not the only one. I've had 3 similar cases come through here this year, all involving minority homeowners and all tied to the same bank. It's a pattern." Hope surged. "So we fight it, right?" Robert sighed. "I'd love to, but I can't take the case. Conflict of interest. One of my former partners now works with Crestmark. I'd be disqualified before we stepped into a courtroom." Darius stared at him, stunned. "Then who can I go to?" Robert looked away. "That's the thing. Most of the legal aid clinics are overwhelmed, and the few firms big enough to take this on either have connections to Crestmark or don't want to touch something this messy. They'll tell you it's not worth it unless there's guaranteed money at the end, and even then, only if you're the right kind of client." Darius's jaw tightened. "The right kind of client, meaning not me." Robert didn't answer. That night, Darius drove home under gray skies, a storm gathering on the horizon. He stopped by the library, one he used to visit as a child, and checked out 3 books on property law and mortgage fraud. He wasn't a lawyer, but he was a teacher. He knew how to study, knew how to think critically, how to pull apart a complex system and rebuild it in understandable pieces. He spent the next week transforming his home into a research lab. The walls were covered in sticky notes and timelines. He downloaded court filings from public records databases, analyzing successful challenges to foreclosure. He highlighted laws and statutes he never imagined he'd have to understand. Truth in Lending Act, RESPIA violations, chain of title protocols. He learned about robo-signing, shell lenders, and how banks often preyed on black and brown communities with impunity. The more he read, the angrier he became. He learned that what happened to him was far from rare. Families just like his had lost everything because no one had the time, energy, or knowledge to fight. They were worn down by systems designed to exhaust them. Paperwork, dead ends, legal jargon, unreachable helplines, and manufactured urgency. But Darius had no intention of going quietly. He turned his living room into a mock courtroom and began practicing his statements aloud. He recited case law as he cooked breakfast, debated imaginary bank attorneys in the mirror, and argued constitutional protections with the empty air before he slept. And something began to change in him. Not in the way fear often morphs into quiet resignation, but in the way purpose is born from fire. He stopped asking why this was happening to him and began asking what now. Because if the system expected him to roll over and let them take the one thing his mother left him, they'd pick the wrong man. When he wasn't studying, he visited Crestmark's branch, requesting original copies of loan documents under Georgia's right to request disclosure. He was stonewalled at every turn, of course. You'll need to contact our legal department. That's not available without a subpoena. I'm not authorized to provide that. It only steeled him further. Late one night, as thunder rolled across the sky and the power flickered in his old house, Darius made a decision that would change everything. He would represent himself in court. It was a risk. He knew that. He could lose, badly. But he also knew that sitting still while they erased his past wasn't an option. He remembered his mother's hands, calloused from factory work, always moving, always building. She didn't leave him much, but she left him this, and he would fight for it until his last breath. With trembling fingers, he filed a pro se motion for emergency injunction to halt the foreclosure proceedings. The clerk at the courthouse looked at him with mild pity, barely masking her skepticism. "You're representing yourself?" "Yes, ma'am," he replied calmly. "You understand the risks?" "I understand what's at stake." As he walked out into the night, a cold wind cutting through his jacket, Darius knew the odds were stacked. He knew judges didn't like people like him challenging the process. He knew the bank's legal team would try to humiliate him, drown him in paper, and use every tool in the legal toolbox to silence him. But he also knew something else. He knew how to teach. He knew how to argue. And he knew what justice looked like. So, he would learn the law. He would teach the courtroom. And he would prove, with every breath, that knowledge in the right hands could be more powerful than any legal degree. And in that moment, standing beneath a flickering street lamp, with court papers in one hand and a storm swelling in the distance, Darius Thompson didn't feel like a victim. He felt like a man ready for war. The courthouse rose like a stone sentinel against the pale Atlanta morning sky, its columns weathered by years of whispered injustices and heavy-handed rulings. Darius Thompson stood at the bottom of its marble steps, a man armed with nothing but a binder full of evidence, a borrowed suit, and the kind of resolve that cannot be taught. He took a deep breath and stepped inside. The courtroom was cold, both in temperature and temperament. The judge, the Honorable Clifford Ames, sat perched on the bench with a frown carved into his features like granite. He was known for his brisk demeanor and even brisker rulings. No nonsense, impatient with delays, and particularly skeptical of pro se litigants. Darius's seat was empty. No lawyer beside him, no legal entourage, just a worn leather binder clutched tightly in his lap. Across from him sat Crestmark Bank's legal team, led by their star litigator, Marjorie Vance. Her reputation preceded her, polished, relentless, and unshakable. She barely glanced at Darius, her expression reading more amusement than concern. When the judge called the case to order, his tone was already tinged with disbelief. "Mr. Thompson, I see you've chosen to represent yourself. Are you aware of the seriousness of this matter?" Darius stood. "Yes, Your Honor, I am." "And you understand the complexities of foreclosure law?" "I've spent the last 6 weeks studying every line of it." There was a stifled chuckle from Vance's table. The judge didn't reprimand it. The proceedings began. Vance moved first, painting Darius as a confused homeowner in denial. She recited procedural compliance like a machine, how the bank had fulfilled every requirement, how the second mortgage was legally binding, how the foreclosure was unfortunate but lawful. She referred to him only as the defendant, never acknowledging his name. Darius listened, his hand steady on the binder's cover, but inside his pulse hammered. When it was his turn, he stood slowly, walked to the center of the room, and opened the binder. His voice was calm, but clear. And as he began to speak, a hush fell over the courtroom. "I am not here today to argue emotion," he began. "I'm here to argue facts. Facts that point to a grave injustice, not just against me, but potentially against many others like me." He held up the mortgage agreement, the original one, paid in full, and displayed a copy for the judge. "This," he said, "is my mother's final deed, paid off in 2014. The bank acknowledges this." Then he produced the second document, the supposed second mortgage taken out 4 years later. "And this," he continued, holding it next to the first, "is the reason I stand before you today, accused of defaulting on a loan I never applied for. A loan my mother supposedly signed while recovering from a stroke." He walked toward the bench. "Your Honor, look at these signatures. Even a layperson can see they're different. The curvature, the pressure, the slant. One shows confidence, the other, hesitancy. That's not just aging, that's forgery." The judge squinted at the documents. Vance objected immediately. "Your Honor, unless the defendant is a certified handwriting expert, this is speculative at best." Darius didn't flinch. "I'm not a handwriting expert, but I do have affidavits from two who are." He handed them over. The judge paused, brows lifting as he flipped through the neatly printed reports. "This isn't all," Darius continued. "When I requested documentation from the bank on the issuance of the second mortgage, I was stonewalled. No transaction logs, no funding records, no notary ledger, nothing. And then I found this." He pulled another sheet from the binder. "A filing error. The original mortgage transfer to Crestmark Bank was missing a key element, a recorded endorsement from the previous lender. According to state law, this makes the transfer invalid, which means Crestmark never legally owned the loan they're claiming I defaulted on." Vance tried to interrupt again, but the judge held up a hand, signaling her to wait. Darius wasn't done. He showed tax documents, emails, utility bills, proof he'd never missed a payment, never received notice of this phantom second mortgage until the foreclosure notice arrived at his door. He showed a notarized statement from his mother's former caretaker, attesting to her mental and physical state at the time the loan was allegedly signed. He walked the judge through every step, every piece, methodically, relentlessly, like a teacher guiding a reluctant student toward a difficult truth. By the time he finished, the courtroom was silent. The judge leaned back in his chair, his earlier skepticism replaced by a quiet unease. He glanced at Vance, whose confident mask had begun to crack. "Ms. Vance," Judge Ames said, "do you have a rebuttal?" Vance stood, but her voice no longer carried its earlier sharpness. "We'd request time to verify the claims." The judge cut her off. "You've had time. This foreclosure was fast-tracked. The defendant wasn't even granted an opportunity to dispute the debt before action was taken. Now he presents evidence that raises serious questions, not only about this loan, but about the bank's due diligence in verifying it." He turned back to Darius. "Mr. Thompson, based on the evidence presented today, I am granting a temporary stay on the foreclosure. Further, I'm ordering Crestmark Bank to provide all documents requested by the defendant within 7 days, including original loan agreements, transaction logs, and notary records. Failure to comply will result in sanctions. Darius exhaled for what felt like the first time in hours. His legs nearly gave way as he returned to his seat. It wasn't over. Not yet. But something had shifted. The smirk was gone from Vance's face. The judge no longer saw him as just a desperate man clinging to a house. He saw him as someone who had uncovered something real, something dangerous. As the court adjourned and the murmurs filled the gallery, Darius stood slowly, his binder now lighter than it had felt when he entered. A small group of onlookers approached, some strangers, some familiar. One man clasped his shoulder. A woman whispered, "Keep going." Outside, the sun had finally broken through the morning clouds. Darius looked up at the sky and let it warm his face. He had walked into that courtroom alone, underestimated by everyone. But he'd walked out with something they couldn't deny: the truth. And he was just getting started. The news broke like a crack of thunder across the city. Local teacher fights foreclosure, reveals potential mortgage fraud. The headline read, on the evening broadcast, Darius Thompson's name spoken with a mix of curiosity and admiration. The clip of him walking out of the courtroom, binder in hand and head high, played on repeat. Within days, his inbox filled with messages, some from supporters, others from people desperate for help. One email, however, stood out from the rest. It was simple, unassuming, no subject line, just a single sentence in the body. "I used to work for Crestmark. I have something you need to see." It was signed, G. Walker. He hesitated before replying, unsure if it was bait. But the next morning, a manila envelope appeared on his porch, tucked discreetly between a stack of circulars. Inside were dozens of photocopied documents, internal memos, email exchanges, and redacted reports. Darius sat at his kitchen table as the weight of what he was holding slowly settled on him. Crestmark wasn't just negligent. They were predatory, strategically targeting homeowners in predominantly black neighborhoods for second mortgages, many of them forged or deceptively sold. The memos outlined tactics: pushing reverse mortgages onto the elderly, fast-tracking foreclosures to avoid legal scrutiny, coaching notaries on how to bypass standard identification procedures. One line chilled him to the bone: risk profile, low litigation threat, high asset turnover. That was how they saw people like him, like his mother: low risk, easy to take from. He reached back out to the sender. Gregory Walker turned out to be a former compliance analyst who had resigned quietly 6 months earlier. Over coffee, in a dim corner of a cafe on Auburn Avenue, Gregory confirmed what Darius feared. The second mortgage was part of a larger scheme. When Walker began raising internal concerns, he was warned, then sidelined. So he walked away. But the guilt never left him. "They thought no one would ever question it," Gregory said quietly. "And usually, no one does." Darius's hands shook as he thumbed through the last few pages. "I'm not letting this go." He didn't. What started as a personal fight quickly expanded into something far larger. Civil rights groups took notice. So did local activists. Within 2 weeks, Darius was invited to speak at a community town hall hosted at a packed recreation center in South Atlanta. He stood on a makeshift stage, the same binder in hand, and told his story not as a victim, but as a teacher. He didn't rant. He didn't accuse. He laid out the facts: how it began, what he found, and how the same thing could happen to anyone in that room. You don't lose your home in a day. he said, voice calm and steady. You lose it in pieces. One missed signature, one forged page, one silent assumption that the system will protect you. It won't. Not unless we make it. The room was silent when he finished. Then a hand rose, then another. People began to speak up. Stories of sudden loan increases, mysterious refinancing offers, letters they didn't understand until it was too late. The floodgates opened. By the end of the week, a coalition had formed. Lawyers, journalists, data analysts, and clergy members began gathering evidence of similar foreclosure patterns. Neighborhoods were mapped. Names were cross-referenced. The picture that emerged was damning. Crestmark had disproportionately targeted minority homeowners for financial products they didn't need or never signed, profiting on the confusion and the chaos. But exposing the truth wasn't enough. Darius connected with the Georgia Justice Initiative, a nonprofit with a reputation for handling housing discrimination cases. Together, they prepared a class action lawsuit against Crestmark, naming Darius as the lead plaintiff. It was no longer just about one house. It was about a system designed to strip wealth from the very communities that had fought hardest to build it. Of course, the bank didn't sit idle. Almost overnight, Darius noticed cars parked outside his house longer than necessary. He received anonymous calls warning him to let it go. His school received complaints about his political activism, questioning whether his conduct was appropriate for an educator. He was called into the principal's office, forced to explain himself. But instead of apologizing, he handed over a copy of the class action filing. If this makes me unfit to teach history, he said, then maybe we've forgotten what history really is. He kept teaching. He kept organizing. And he kept uncovering more. One night, he was invited to appear on a local radio program to discuss housing justice. During the call-in segment, an elderly woman from Decatur shared a story nearly identical to his. A foreclosure based on a loan she never took, rubber-stamped by a notary who claimed never to have met her. Darius jotted down every detail, then asked her to meet with the initiative's legal team. The stories kept coming. Soon, the media caught wind. National outlets ran features on the teacher who took on the bank. A documentary filmmaker reached out. He declined at first, not wanting to be seen as a spectacle, but he eventually agreed, on the condition that it highlight others, not just him. This isn't my victory, he said. It's our resistance. Behind the scenes, Gregory Walker was preparing to testify. He knew what it would mean. Professional exile, possibly worse. But watching Darius speak, watching the movement swell, he realized something. Silence had never protected anyone. In the weeks that followed, the class action suit moved forward. Court dates were scheduled. Depositions were taken. And through it all, Darius kept showing up. Not just for himself, but for every person who had sat across from a banker and been told, without words, that they didn't matter. He walked the hallways of his school the same way he walked into those courtrooms. Head up, eyes forward, with the quiet conviction of a man who had learned, piece by piece, how power operates and how to confront it. The battle wasn't won, not yet. But for the first time, the system was blinking under the light. And Darius, the man it tried to erase, was becoming the one it couldn't ignore. The courtroom was packed. Camera crews, notepads, hushed whispers. It was the kind of morning where history felt like it was unfolding in real time. Darius Thompson sat at the front, shoulders squared, hands folded in his lap. Beside him, attorneys from the Georgia Justice Initiative shuffled thick stacks of documents, their faces solemn but confident. Across the aisle, Crestmark's legal team was a portrait of corporate discomfort: tight jaws, downcast eyes, silence where once there had been certainty. Judge Ames entered the room with the same practiced authority, but something in his step was different now. Resignation, maybe, or awareness. He cleared his throat and began. In the matter of Thompson et al. Versus Crestmark Financial Group, this court has reviewed the evidence presented, including testimony from former employees, forensic signature analysis, and internal communications obtained during discovery. He paused, the quiet deepening. It is the finding of this court that Crestmark Financial engaged in systemic and intentional fraud through the falsification of mortgage agreements, the manipulation of foreclosure timelines, and the targeting of minority homeowners under the assumption that legal resistance would be minimal. The foreclosure of Mr. Thompson's property is hereby nullified, and the defendant is awarded compensatory damages for the emotional and financial distress incurred. Gasps, then applause, then tears. Darius didn't move for a moment. It wasn't shock. It wasn't disbelief. It was the stillness of something long fought for finally arriving. When he turned to face the gallery, he saw his students watching from the back, their eyes wide, their hands clapping. His principal nodded. And in the corner, Gregory Walker and the Decatur woman, the very first voices to speak out after him, held each other, quietly sobbing. The ruling sparked immediate waves beyond the courthouse. Within weeks, state legislators launched a public inquiry into predatory mortgage practices. A bipartisan committee was formed to examine not just Crestmark, but the broader industry. Policy changes were introduced: mandatory verification calls for high-risk loans, more rigorous oversight of mortgage transfers, and harsher penalties for fraudulent notarizations. Darius was invited to testify before the Georgia Senate. He walked into that chamber not as a plaintiff, but as a witness, an educator, and a voice that could no longer be ignored. But the greatest transformation didn't happen in courtrooms or on the evening news. It happened in neighborhoods. Foreclosures that had been rubber-stamped were now being reopened. Families who thought they'd lost everything were contacted by legal aid. And in churches, libraries, and school gyms across Atlanta, workshops began popping up. Know your rights, understanding your mortgage, fighting back. Darius founded a nonprofit to support them. He called it the Miriam Project, named after his mother. Its mission was simple: to make sure no one else had to fight alone. He recruited volunteers, law students, retired attorneys, teachers. They trained homeowners to read their contracts, understand the fine print, and demand transparency. What began as survival had become legacy. One afternoon, long after the media spotlight had moved on, Darius stood on the steps of his restored home. The original deed, framed once again, hung just inside the front hallway. A teenage boy from down the street approached him, carrying a small folder. "My grandmother's getting letters now," the boy said, voice tight. "They said she owes money she doesn't remember borrowing." Darius took the folder gently, opened it, and nodded. "Come by tomorrow," he said. "We'll figure it out together." That evening, as the sun dipped behind the Atlanta skyline and the porch light flickered on, Darius sat with a cup of tea in his hands and quiet in his chest. He thought about the months behind him, the fear, the frustration, the rage, But what lingered now wasn't bitterness, it was clarity. Justice, he'd learned, wasn't a single moment or verdict. It was a practice, a habit, a fire passed hand to hand. He closed his eyes and exhaled. The fight had changed him, but in the end, it had revealed him too. Not just a teacher, not just a homeowner, but a defender of memory, of dignity, of the quiet power that comes from knowing your worth. And though the battle had been his, the victory now belonged to many. Darius Thompson's story began as a quiet battle, the kind most people never see coming. A beloved history teacher in Atlanta, he was thrust into a nightmare when a foreclosure notice arrived for the home he had long since paid off. What initially seemed like a clerical error unraveled into a calculated scheme, one rooted in greed, negligence, and systemic injustice. But what Crestmark Financial didn't anticipate was that the man they targeted was not just a homeowner. He was an educator, a fighter, and someone unwilling to surrender. He started alone, abandoned by lawyers, dismissed by banks, underestimated by the courts. Yet Darius refused to be silenced. He transformed his living room into a war room, studying mortgage law by night and defending his name by day. In court, he didn't just survive. He stunned seasoned attorneys and a skeptical judge with meticulous research, powerful testimony, and unwavering conviction. What made Darius's journey extraordinary wasn't only his personal victory. It was how he turned that victory into a platform for others. His fight exposed a broader scheme of fraudulent lending practices that had quietly robbed vulnerable homeowners for years. With the help of whistleblowers, civil rights groups, and a growing chorus of voices, Darius didn't just win his house back. He sparked policy changes, launched community education initiatives, and gave voice to the voiceless. Through all of it, he remained rooted in humility. The teacher, who once stood alone in a courtroom, would go on to lead workshops, advise lawmakers, and mentor families on the brink of losing everything. His nonprofit, the Miriam Project, continues to protect and empower homeowners, ensuring that what happened to him never happens again, at least not without a fight. The lesson from Darius Thompson's story is profound. Resilience, knowledge, and community are our greatest tools against injustice. You don't need a title to make change. You don't need a fortune to fight back. What you need is belief in your worth, in the truth, and in the power of collective action. In today's world, where institutions can often feel distant or indifferent, Darius's journey reminds us that even the most ordinary person can hold the line against extraordinary forces. It teaches us to question, to learn, to organize, and most importantly, to never let silence become surrender. Whether you're facing unfair treatment at work, predatory contracts, or systemic bias, the path forward begins with refusing to look away. Learn your rights, speak your truth, find your allies, and never, ever underestimate your voice. If this story moved you, inspired you, or reminded you of the power one person can wield, please consider subscribing to this channel. Your support helps us bring more untold stories of courage, injustice, and hope to light. Together, we can keep fighting and keep telling the stories that matter. See you in the next one.